before our break and our second party of the event. I'm Jennifer Cole. I'm a professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development and a cultural anthropologist. It's been, I study, one of the things I study is memory, and it's been a completely fascinating experience to watch us construct our collective memory in a very dynamic and supple fashion. It was really fun yesterday to hear Bob Levine's talk and then hear people add to it and kind of co-constitute the memory together. So it's really been fascinating experience. So we're going to start with, we have our four chairs here. Norman Bradburn, Susan Golden Meadow. I'm going in order of from earlier to later. Susan Golden Meadow, John Lucy, and Richard Taub. Some people have been, we've had a long discussion about who was chair when, and nobody seems to agree when, but they've all been chair at different moments, and Richard has been chair for many, many years. And these are, yes, exactly. And these are all the people who are responsible for bringing me up, so I'm very eager to hear from them. So please join me first in welcoming Norman Bradburn.
I should get 14 minutes, though.
You should.
Do I get 14 minutes?
Don't worry, I'll give you all my time. You can have my minutes.
Like a number of people who sort of said, in some sense, I don't belong here. I mean, I'm an outsider or whatever, and so in a technical sense, I was never chairman of HD. And I will give you in a minute a context for that statement. But I want to first say how I got involved with HD. Because well, no, that's not true. I would say uniquely here, but that's not true. I came to the University of Chicago in 1960. Well, I've been an undergraduate here. And I do want to, just maybe before I get on to that, to echo what was said this morning about the degree to which the college experience has shaped my, and I think many people's, view of HD. And I think the sense in which it, not literally, but intellectually grew out of something which was also going on in the college in the 50s and 60s. Well, the 50s when I was a student there. And somebody, I think it was David Orlinsky, referred to the Self-Culture and Society course, which we always knew as Soc 2, which was a very formative experience. It, in some sense, mirrored intellectually insofar as HD has a curriculum, that is certainly the course or the experience I had as undergraduate, which moved me from thinking I was going to be a chemist to being a social scientist, and in some sense is a background to everything that's happened since. And we've all talked about formative experiences, and that, for me, that was the beginning of a formative experience. The other thing, which is a commonality that I just want to point out, is that a number of us, in this sense Bob Levine, who was also an undergraduate here with me, and Richard Taub and Rick Schwader, all I think came out of the social relations department at Harvard, and that is also something which is very HD. And I, in spite of what Bob said yesterday about the failure of the social relations department because it tried to have that unifying theory. So as a student, I never felt that. I think I used to feel, and maybe I in some sense still do, although empirically it's probably not true, that those of us who came here and were in HD were the real embodiment of what Sakharov was trying to produce. And I always thought when it went out of when the department closed, I sort of thought how ironic, just when they produced a generation that really embodies what Sauk Row was all about, the department goes out of, it folds its tents and goes back to away. So that's just as a kind of personal background of that. I came to the University of Chicago as a faculty member in 1960, and what surprises a lot of people is I came in the business school because I had done cross-cultural studies on psychology of entrepreneurship in Turkey, and the business school had a program on, well, in fact, in the university there was a lot of interest in economic development, cultural aspects, and psychological aspects of economic development. And they were trying to build an interdisciplinary group in the business school of that. And I came to be part of that. It fell apart shortly after I got there because the other members, one died, one left, and one went back into anthropology, where he is Manning Nash, which many of you may know. So I was doing a variety of kinds of things, and I was trying to remember. I was telling Mike Hoffman, trying to remember how I really got to know the people in HD, and I really don't have very firm memories. In the 60s, this is when I really had no formal connection, but I was on some committees, PhD committees at that time, and I got to know Bernice quite well. And then in 1971, I came back to the, I had been on sabbatical in 71, and I got a call in the spring of 71 saying, would I come back and be the master of the social sciences in the collegiate division? Completely, sort of return, in some sense, return to my roots. But so I said, well, come talk about it. So I came and talked about it, and Edward Levy, who was president of the university, really talked me into it. But, and along with that was the position as associate dean of the division. And then to people's sort of embarrassment or something, he says, well, you don't have an appointment in the division. You've got to pick a department to be a part of. And I got, basically the psychology department said, why don't you come be a member of this? Somebody said come to sociology, but I wanted to come to HD. So that's how I got to be in HD. About a year or so later, I said this yesterday, if people are there, I got the call from John Wilson, who was provost of the university, saying that the psychology department, senior people have come and said they cannot depend on they can't decide on a chairman, and we've got to reorganize psychology, and would I chair a committee to reorganize psychology? And so I did that, and we had a rather, it wasn't too contentious, but because everybody realized something had to be done. And I used HD as essentially the model for what my vision of what a psychology, or well, should have been HD written large, but as essentially a federation of interdisciplinary committees with psychology as a strong root, some of them more towards biology and some more towards social things and so forth. And so it would be a collection of committees, or federation of committees. And as I mentioned yesterday, one on cognition and communication, which David McNeil had taken the lead in, fulfilled that sort of view that I had, or aspirations I had for the field. The Committee on Biopsychology wasn't quite as much as I had hoped, but it was there. The rest of psychology behaves more or less as people have alluded to. Psychologists have behaved throughout the country and history. And for a couple of years, I held them off as the old department was running down. But after 3 years, the old department had sort of phased out almost all of its students, and we had to do something. So I sort of relented, and we had a committee on personality and social psychology, which was just an agglomeration of not elsewhere classified psychologists, kind of in a way. And so that became, and then HD was one of the elements of that. And so in that sense, that's why I'm here as chairman, because I was chairman of that department for 6 years, getting it going and so forth. And then HD, the thing which I had hoped about HD was, this was alluded to very early, as a committee in the old sense of the term, the formal requirement was that everybody had joint appointments with some department of research. As mentioned, Dan Friedman and Bernice, for reasons we don't know anymore, did not, but everybody else did. And sometimes, as was it you, Richard, I think maybe said that the college counted as the thing, and that in some sense, in my case, well, I guess I had an appointment in the business school. But I had hoped then by this new structure, then HD would be free to hire its own people without, as a quasi-department in that sense, and relieved from the pressure that it had when it was a standalone committee. Now, then, as you will hear from the rest, it was also called a behavioral science department, and that has, I gathered from several comments, that when it later on that became a tremendously difficult issue. Perhaps the way it got that way is, and this committee that on reorganizing things, because I knew it was going to be a contentious issue, I didn't bring it up until the final hour of the last meeting, the last hour of the last meeting. I sort of said, oh, by the way, this new department's got to have a name. What shall we call it? And to my surprise and delight, I hadn't. David McNeil, who was a psycholinguist, said, let's call it behavioral science. And everybody agreed. So that's why it became behavioral science. And later on, the reactionary forces, I think, of psychology began to do their ways, and people wanted to have psychology again. But anyway, I'll let the others talk about that problem.
Okay. Since everybody's saying how we got here, I'll tell you how I got here too. I came in January of 1976, and I came into education. Which was a bit of a surprise since I'd never taken an education course in my life. Nonetheless, I was hired as an educational psychologist at a time when the University of Chicago was hiding its developmental people over in education. So there was Janellen Huttenlocher, Ken Kay, Allison Clark Stewart, and then me. And we were the developmental people, even though there was this thing called human development, which is a little bit of a complication. But I was chair of human development twice, for a very short time. I wasn't kicked out or anything. I really was intended to be there for a short period of time. Each time a year, 1995 to 1996, and 1999 to 2000. And it was short, but really important things happened under my chairmanship. The first thing we did, we hired John Lucy, which was a major accomplishment. John Lucy, of course, as you all know, is a product of this human development, of Committee on Human Development. And he was a terrific hire, because we hired back John, and he helped guide us and make HD what it is today. So it's a really important hire. And because of all the history that Norman just talked about, it wasn't an easy hire. Because at that point already, we had, that committee structure really did allow HD for the first time to go, each of the committees in psychology, in behavioral sciences, had access to the dean. So we could each make our own appointments.
You had access to me first.
To you first, right. And then the dean. But the chair was supposed to be sort of, just sure, do it, right. by the time we got to my chairmanship, we'd already set up an executive committee. Tom Trabasso was the chair. We had an executive committee, and people weren't so crazy about just saying, sure, this committee can do this one, this one can. So we had to get our appointments approved by the executive committee. And at that point, the behavioral science people were thinking that maybe they didn't want to be behavioral science anymore. They wanted to be psychology. And psychologists wanted to hire psychologists. So we were okay with John, because he's got some psychology in him. But he's also got a lot of other stuff in him that, I actually think it was to Tom Trabasso's credit that, in fact, we got this through and we managed to hire Tom Trabasso. That was my accomplishment the first time. The second time, when I was chair, it was already 1999, so this sort of breakup that had been happening between psychology and Committee on Human Development was really a serious breakup at that point, because behavioral sciences had changed its name. We had voted to become psychology. And once it became psychology, the goal was to collapse the committee structure. But HD didn't want to be collapsed. HD wanted to be its own thing. Psychology wanted to hire psychologists. HD didn't. I mean, it wasn't hire one or two, but it wanted to hire other people as well. And so it really was a structure that was completely untenable at the point. So we managed. Now, Howard Nussbaum was the chair of psychology. I was the chair of HD. And Richard Saller was the dean at the time. And we managed to break it into pieces. And the objection, actually, I think psychology was pretty happy to let HD go, and HD was happy to be gone. But the deans didn't like it. And the reason the deans didn't like it is because they didn't want this little area to balloon out. They had one structure. They just thought if we divided it into two structures, then they might each think they could get bigger. So, as it turned out, right, they put a cap on us. And we decided there were 5 people who were jointly appointed. They could continue to be jointly appointed throughout that period of their lives. I'll do it, don't worry. They could be jointly appointed for the rest of the time, but when they retired, their lines would go either to HD or to Psych. And it was arbitrarily decided. You didn't have a choice. You thought you did, but you didn't have a choice. Richard decided that Rick, Bert, and John's lines go to HD, and my line and Martha McClintock's line would go to Psych. So actually, it's only Bert's line that is, we're all still around. We're still kicking here. God willing, we'll still kick for a longer. And so we split into these 2 lines at that point, but we were all completely jointly appointed, and so it didn't have any effect at all until recently now when we have to decide where the lines are. Huh? Or we have,
When we have to die, they have to decide.
Yeah, when we have to, yeah, right. Yeah, well, let's not go there, okay?
Retire.
Retire. Okay. So that was very important, splitting HD and psychology. And I did a couple other things. I hired 3 really good people. I hired Tanya, which was terrific for our department. I hired Joe Gahn, who was also terrific for our department. Neither one is still around, but they really, I think, had some formative things. They really affected the way the department was shaped at the time, and we are grateful to them. And maybe the most important thing I hired Janie Lardner. So she actually, I don't even know if Janie knows, Janie was recommended by Mary Brandon, who knew her in education, and she said, you take her. Because we now then could get an administrative assistant. We were really independent enough. We were a real committee. So we could get a person. And we nabbed Janie, and she's been here ever since. That's it. That's our done.
Okay, well, I spoke this morning about the first chairmanship I had, which was passed to Susan, which was then passed to
No, you
Richard.
couldn't be the the second time, you mean? Because the first time I hired you.
No. But after you were chair,
Right.
between those 2, I appeared,
Yes.
And so I was going to pass the baton to Richard first to talk about the intervening years, and then I was chair a second time, and I have sort of different things to say. Because I think I did that this morning. I talked about
Oh, you did that already?
Yeah, I did that. I introduced you 2 this morning as part 2 and 3 of my first chairmanship. Okay. You did it perfectly, and he's going to do it too.
Okay. John
You
made
can
the,
retime now.
John was supposed to be chairman. He made the sacrifice to become a master in the social sciences. And then the issue was you had to have somebody who was not a psychologist and not an anthropologist to be chair. I was the only sociologist, so I got to be chair, which I then did forever. The subtitle of this, my little talk, and I hope I have a little bit more than 7 minutes, is Only the Paranoid Survive. Okay. So what happened in our situation was, again, the older faculty members had seen the education department close. And the reason it closed, there are a number of issues, but one was the budget had to be reduced by 10%, and they could be either a little bit from every department or get rid of one department. So for various reasons, you can see it's much easier in a faculty vote. You'd much rather get rid of one department than have somebody cut from your own department. So, education disappeared. So when we came into existence, as John said this morning, there was a tiny group with the lines were just Bert, Rick, and John. The question was, would we survive? There were, in fact, many people in other divisions, which will remain nameless, who thought that we should not survive. That, in fact, we were a kind of weird group, and that we were small. We took positions away from other departments, and they should get them back. Okay? So our goal at that time was to say, what are the things we can do that make it hard for them to get rid of us? Okay? So the first thing we did was we changed our name from committee to department. Okay? Department, we really were a department. We were in fact a department. Committee was confusing because, as John has suggested, normally they were joint appointments and we were making our own appointments. But department sounds better. In fact, after we made the change, which really had no other justification, I would get letters from all over the country congratulating me on having made this terrific change. The next one was, what else do we have to do? Well, the next one we have to do, there are two things. We have to grow. Okay, that's really important. And the other thing we have to do is we have to, again, get our clutches into this place in a way that makes it hard to get rid of us. So on that basis, we decided to have an undergraduate program. The education department always was asked several times to have an undergraduate program, and they refused. It was clear that the college was beginning to become, when I came here, this is a slight step off the road, but when I came here in 1969, there were 1,800 students in the college. Today there are 6,000, okay, 5,700, 5,800. And growing, it's going to go to 7,000. So the idea was if we had an undergraduate program, we would be doing something that was really important for the institution. And it was prescient. I won't say all the bad things that come with having a large college, a lot of money, which is why we do it. But the bad thing is that now administrators count the number of undergraduate students you teach as part of justifying the size of your department. And we now have situations, Lindsay, for example, has asked me in the last year, she's co-teaching a course with somebody in psychology. The home department is psychology. She's upset HD won't get any credit for the courses. That's stupid. I mean, but we understood, and we figured out that if we had a college undergraduate program, as the college was growing in importance, they would love us more. Okay? So the next thing, after that, the other thing we had to continue to think about was how we grew. We had a dean whose idea was that we were a precious little stone, and that as this precious little stone, we were not supposed to grow, but we'd have a little spotlight on us. Okay. Our plan was that, again, if we were to survive, we have to grow. Now, John had already made a decision for us that began our growth, which is that he agreed to be this master in exchange for, we don't know how many positions in the end. For you didn't get,
Plus one.
but you didn't get them all.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, we
We're
did.
here.
So at any rate, what's that? Lines. No, faculty. That's another one.
No,
Yeah.
your line was part of the bargain.
Yeah. At any rate, so
He sold himself for
that's right.
HD.
so
What Richard said at the time is, we can't do anything if we don't have some leverage, and we don't have any leverage unless one of us has an outside offer. So when the dean approached me, I said, that's an inside offer, we'll take that and leverage it. So that was, that was the way we got those positions. Then when we also agreed to have an undergraduate program, we went to Dean Boyer, and we said, hey, you know, we have to do so many things that we really need more faculty members, and that our dean, the dean of the division, said, we don't have any more money for you, you're just the right size. Maybe a little too big already. So at that point, then, John Boyer gave us some positions, and there's a controversy about whether we ever got them. But what we did, I had a college appointment, and that one was then leveraged into HD. Subsequently, it turned out that there was money available for education. And so the question was, could we find educators who do human development and would fit in our department? So we are very grateful to have our current chair. We were sitting around at a meeting saying, who can we get who would fit? And somebody in the meeting said, how about Margaret Spencer? And everybody said, ooh. So that is how we got Margaret. I wish it were that easy, but but nonetheless, the point is that we got Margaret and we got Guanglei Hong, both of them because of the education program. So what we continued to do then, we had one more person who then becomes a member of the department, which is, you met this morning, Eugene Reichel. And I think it's probably illegal for me to talk about how we did that appointment. But the end is, it was clear that what we figured out is, I explained to the dean why he had money left to give us the position. By then, we had you might have guessed that at some point we had a severely adversarial relationship. But by then, we just worked together. I've been chair for 100 years. We were working together and we understood each other. And he agreed he would give us Eugene if we gave away one graduate student. Cheese picking. That's really horrible. That guy was, he's not here, is he? But Mark was so cheap that it was really ridiculous. So we gave away one graduate student for 3 years in order to get, it's not money, that's the point. It's space saving.
Okay. So that is the part of the story about how we got Eugene. So now, here we are. We're a full-fledged department with distinct, and I have to stipulate, this is not just about bodies, that we were always concerned about having distinguished first-class scholars. And so that what we were able to do under these circumstances then is to build a department, and every dean has said to us, including our present dean, who you know made a lovely speech about us yesterday, our present dean says you are overstaffed and you don't have any needs. So, and he did us out of a position this year. I'm retired. I shouldn't say us. It's those people over there. So at any, well, the one student in the department, Keisha, who was one of the organizers of this, said to me one day, Professor Taub, I think you have failed at retirement. At any rate, so that is the story, and I think that the younger faculty members don't, the older ones still, I think we're pretty well implanted now, but the younger faculty members don't have the paranoia that I think that the older ones do. And we have other big issues to face, some of which John suggested. When most of our I left out of the educators, I'm sorry, Lindsay Richland was another person, and I think she should be included among the education hires. And I think the sad thing in all of this period, which Michael Kaufman underlined so sharply, is that we lost Bert, who represented a particular kind of spirit and something that was very, very important for the unit, and which, in a sense, was something we then had to surmount, because he represented so many things, so many good things for us. And he also, in this new nitpicking way we run the university, he also did something which is they counted every department how many undergraduates they taught. Bert taught thousands. So our record was always very high, no matter what anybody else did. So that is a story of our growth as I perceive it. That's it.
That's great. That's how I perceive it too. Comforting. Yeah. Well, for a while, our head count had a slash. There was the psych/HD. It was one number, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, I've learned one thing today, which is I belong. I was telling you earlier, I can sit on any of these 4 panels because I've been all 4 roles. And I wish I had been on the alum one, because you got to talk about more interesting academic ideas rather than this. So I tried to think of what I could say. I came back to be chair again when Richard stepped down from being chair. And I want to talk a little bit about what I was thinking about at that time, because we were now a decade on from when I'd been passed the mantle over to Susan. We sort of accomplished the size issues I raised this morning, all right? And we had, I was saying we had to get up to a certain threshold. Our goal was 12. I think we're at 13 now. If we get this higher, we're trying to get. We wanted to have a mix of people beyond psychologists. We now are flush with anthropology people and sociologists now. We're looking good on all the sort of obvious metrics. I think there are 2 issues that I've focused on during the time I was there, beyond little issues. One thing about being bigger is you have to administer yourself in a different way. And so it became too much, I judged, watching Richard, to be chair of the department and chair of the graduate group. And when I was in that position doing both of those, and Bert passed away, I also became undergraduate chair. And so at that point, we really had some discussions in the department about beginning to divide the labor up, so that the younger people who are mid-career could actually be chair for 3 years and come out of it with their research flowing. But I think that I've seen a challenge to our interdisciplinary mission, if you will, in the last few years. And it comes from several distinct places. I think, first of all, that the various disciplines are now more rigid in some ways about membership criteria and meeting them. So we would hire new assistant professors in who had extreme concerns about their ability to be recognized in their home discipline, to have relationships with their home discipline. This was much looser back in the day than it is today. And these are legitimate concerns, okay? They really have concerns about them, but they're also concerns about their students and their careers. And I think there were more interdisciplinary places they could go. But now you have to try to get your student into the interdisciplinary ethos of HD, but at the same time, you have to be marching them through the professionalization things that they need to get a job. And this is something that Joan alluded to this morning. You really have to be able to pass in your own field, at least. And that means deeply engaging with a lot of things which may not be so much intellectual things, although they could be, but also just the practical, how does this discipline work? How does it hire? When does it hire? Even in the academic year, it turns out to be an issue. I think also some of the disciplines drifted in ways that were less helpful for us. So with the move toward neuroscience and brain models in psychology, the number of talented behavioral science people, I would say, began to erode, the ones that we could talk to. And I think that it's not that they're not there, but it became a bit harder. Anthropology in some quarters has taken a really anti-psychological stance that didn't exist in a previous generation. Harder to find the people. And finally, I think it's been alluded to, we lost some of our sister programs, the people who we sent our undergraduates to and the ones that sent us back, faculty or vice versa. As these other interdisciplinary programs went down, they also took with them interdisciplinary jobs, all right? And I think that meant this disciplinary thing got reinforced. I'm not saying we shouldn't keep doing it. I definitely believe so. And I have a slightly different take on it than some of the other people. I mean, we've talked about tolerance, and I'm absolutely there. It's about tolerating ways of thinking that aren't yours. But there's a more positive thing, which is, at least for me and I think for some other people here, we're just interested in all this stuff. So it's not like I have to be put there with those psychologists or anthropologists. I actually really like psychology. I really find it interesting. I really do psychological experimental work. I do field work. I do linguistic stuff. I do social theory. I like doing all those things. And I think there's a lot of our students who feel that way, that they're not just putting up. So maybe that's being a product of this system, that I have a taste, I have a broader palette of things that I can find interesting. And so if you grow up in such a department, it really is frustrating to go out someplace where people only eat Chinese food or Mexican food or something like that, and you have an interest in a broader range of things. So I do think we have challenges now, and I don't know if I have a solution to offer here, but I think it goes back to something about what Richard said about the paranoid. I think what we have to do is we say at this moment in time, the being interdisciplinary, I think, is now more challenging, and that we have to dedicate some of our time to thinking about how we're going to function and how we're going to place our people in a way that doesn't compromise it too much. So it's really an agenda, and as chair, you come in, you get to know all the students who are going through because you're in that central position. You know all the faculty hires coming in, you know what their concerns are, they come to your door to talk, and you begin to see something happening that wasn't happening before. And it was very different from my first term and the first things we did and what it was a decade later. It's much stronger now. I have one thing here to say, a linguistic example. In the field of linguistics, Chomskyan linguistics rose up in the late 50s and became a rigid paradigm that you had to be in it or you couldn't get a job in linguistics. And a few departments resisted that and remained diverse. And when that paradigm began the process of self-imploding, they couldn't do anything because they had no one there except the people who were in the imploding paradigm. Whereas the departments that were more diverse still had places to begin to regroup. And so I think that there is a place for the interdisciplinary group to be on campus for the division, a place where certain kinds of regrouping can happen. And that's how I think, for example, of our behavioral biology people. It's not really done much in the social sciences, but there's kind of a nucleus there that can be a place for regenerating that if people come to the point where they recognize its value. The second place is to pick up on something from one of the discussions this morning or this afternoon about Bert being a guardian. I think one of the things you are when you're a chair, you kind of put down your own personal agenda for a while and you pick up the departmental agenda. And I remember when I first was talking to Bernice Neugarten when I was here as a grad student, and she was stepping down as chair, and I said, "Oh, aren't you going to miss it?" A totally naive comment. and her answer, though, was interesting. She said, "No, I can finally go to a faculty meeting and say what I think." All right? Because as a chair, you've got to mediate between the various attentions that are there. And I think the question of what does it mean to be HD at a content level does have to be addressed at some point. And we've had a couple of big changes I thought I would mention that for those who are visiting and haven't seen them. Bert's loss was tremendous. It was a loss at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level. But that loss actually began before Bert died, in the sense that we realized we couldn't continue the clinical program. This was a decision made by him, in part when Tanya left. He says, we just can't fight this battle anymore because the accreditation required nationally is so rigid and we have such a tiny faculty, we can't possibly keep doing it. So we began closing out that program. And the question is, well, what do we do in place of it? A clinical program is a very special thing. And for years and years, it was a very valuable thing because a lot of students would come, and if they couldn't get an academic job, they could go out into the healing professions and make a living. And that was really important. And it was actually one of those things that kept us strong during the financial crises, because the three departments in the division that made money were economics, anthropology, and HD, because we were the departments where you could come in and have a reasonably good job prospect because of the national situation. So we were losing something then on a pedagogical level, intellectual level, a career level. What we've done is we've moved in two directions that I think are useful. One is that we've moved into sort of a medical anthropology or medical sociology or something where we don't have to get into clinical settings. The reason we had to give people licensure was you couldn't get into some of these sites if you didn't have approval. Medical problems are much broader in this number of sites you can get into, and I think we can continue to train people with some of the same issues, but now mapped over, and our hires have been made with an eye toward that. Not that we have to have just they do medical, but every time someone who fits the bill works that way, it's resonating with a longer term, deeper intellectual issue. And for my part anyway, I do think we've managed to get people across a couple of disciplines interested in that, or not just one discipline, med-anth, but also in sociology and a little bit in biology. Likewise, we've increased the presence in education. And I think that it's education research, which is important to me. I mean, Bert used to always say we produce clinician scholars, not just clinicians. And we want people who do educational research. And we've got people who've come with a psychological perspective, with a sociological perspective, and I hope in due time with an anthropological one. And that gives us another way in which people can have a career that is distinct and useful if the research career is not as well developed as they'd hoped. The other change from when some of you are here is there's practically nothing on young children anymore in the department, let's say under 5. There's a few people who are from the older era. Practically. No, you have to say, when was the last time we hired in that area? And what we do is, well, Lindsay, I'm going to count in a minute, okay? And aging as well, okay? Where we have rebuilt is in the middle with what I will call middle childhood or school age and adolescence and youth. And so we're very, very strong in the middle, and that's where I put Lindsay. And it's where I put me, and it's where I put a number of other people working on adolescent issues. So being a guardian doesn't mean that you take what you had before and you fix it for all time. It means you sort of get the spirit of what you're trying to do. What's important for us is developmental perspective. It's to ask what questions are relevant for the other issues. All right, so if you're looking at globalization and internationalization, youth are a very important focus. If you're looking at education, this age range is exactly the range you want to be looking at. And so you have to be flexible. I think we have to be flexible too, and we have to ask ourselves, how can we find topics that are of interest to people, that will motivate people to want to come here in sufficient numbers to keep our headcount up, but without sort of imagining that it has to be just what you guys studied when you were here. That kind of transition and change. And every chair, and I know it's something that's facing Margaret now, every single chair has to look at all these hires and ask, what story are we telling that will be a story that will be recognizable out there for students? I guess I have only one last thing to say, as my experience as chair before we moved on. Richard came back again, and then Don Kulik was chair, and then Margaret, so it kind of continued. We were back in a period of some shorter chairships, but you want to stay a long time, Margaret? You want to? I did want to revisit my comment about the importance of students, because that period I talked about, they were absolutely crucial, but they remain crucial in our admissions process, in our annual festivities, in running and populating the workshops. I really do feel it's a collaborative effort with the students, but I do have a slight sense that since we became a department, there became kind of a different division that I hadn't felt there before when I was a student. And I think that's another issue that going forward as a department be useful to ask ourselves how that's happened and whether we can, or whether we want to do anything different than that. So those are my 2 or 3 observations from my second time around, 10 years later. I was saying to Larry after the last session, it was only 2 or 3 years, and I think Richard can check, we were back. You could come here as a postdoc and you would not have known that we had gone through this hourglass of real risk. And I think now we're very robust, but I don't think we're going to be able to take it for granted. Okay? I think if we want to continue to be a gateway to the division where you can come and do any departmental combination that makes sense for you, we've got to be convincing the division that they want such a gateway and that they'd like this kind of interaction. And there are faculty out there in the other departments who are very appreciative of HD. We need them to be on board with us. Okay, so that's what I have to say.
So we can open the floor to questions, comments. Do we have a mic? Yes? Great. Anybody? Yeah, you. Yeah.
Thanks. Rich Sam Williams from PhD 77. So I still don't understand about the name change.
You know,
So could that be put
in which
into the
direction? Behavioral sciences or back to psychology?
comparative human
Oh,
development?
comparative. Oh,
So that part was not,
okay.
I can explain
Discuss.
that, okay?
So
What,
can I.
oh,
See
you
if-
want to?
No, I'm gonna see if you're right.
Oh, okay. The issue was, when we became the department, turns out that in many institutions, departments of human development are in home ec departments, in home ec schools, and so, and in addition, they're in straight-up education schools. So the question was, we changed our name to department because we wanted to look more like a real department, but there was anxiety that we would send out a message that made us part of home ec. I remember Jennifer used to complain that if we weren't careful, we were going to have party planners in the major. That's a total true statement. Right? So at any rate, so the issue was how could we rename ourselves where we kept the human development element, but added something that didn't make us one of those standard packages. And so it turns out that Suzanne Gaskins came up with the name. She said she was lying in bed one night, and suddenly comparative human development came up. And that was why we have the name.
And it kept CHD for those of us who thought of it as the Committee on Human Development. Okay, so it had a double, that was the whole point, it had the double. And Jennifer, by Richard's theory, you're going to be a survivor because you're paranoid.
Other questions?
Yeah, I had a comment. Hearing the history is very fascinating to me. I was only here for a very small part of it. But
Who are you?
Jay Magaziner
Magaziner.
from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And I've seen many different interdisciplinary programs develop over my career. I started one where I am. And it's having the same struggle as being interdisciplinary. I'm no longer leading that program. But it can't get a hold. Nobody quite knows what to do with it. So I commend you on becoming a department because in the unfortunate wisdom of a university like this, they've decided that departments are the main force that should have the resources and should have the lines. And I think my comment is really about the unfortunate path that the university has taken by forcing you into this, because the interdisciplinary nature and the joint appointments is probably what was one of the strengths that the department had, and always what I've marveled about is how you could actually navigate within that, because in my setting you couldn't do that. If you don't belong to a department, you're sort of fighting somebody for how you can spend your time doing something else. So I commend you for the strength of it, and maybe the next phase in this broader, as things move forward, there'll be an opportunity to reconnect with some of your more challenging colleagues elsewhere to create some of those interdisciplinary connections and consider whether we started some things with dual degrees and joint degrees where some of the students wound up with professional master's degrees or some way of taking human development into another sphere which might be more recognizable. I'm not sure that's an answer, but it's all about the organization you're sort of locked into and what you can do within it to actually do the things you want to do.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, but we should point out that one of the things we have done in that regard is that we have a whole group of associate members. And we haven't mentioned that, and we should have really. We have a whole group of associate members who come from other departments. And they very often staff our dissertation committees, help staff it. They often bring expertise to areas that we don't have at all. So that is one of the real issues.
The distinction is they're part of the training program, but they're not part of the governance. So they're not voting on hires, but they are on dissertation committees and whatnot. But I take your point that structure matters, and there were two changes that happened at the university that were tiny little changes, but they have ripples. One is it used to be able to make joint appointments, So at the time of the merger, HD had the equivalent of 15 lines. But they had like 1/3 of this person and 1/2 of that person and 2/3 of that person. But it did give them a financial stake in the department, all right? And that was done away with. You had to have a whole line, okay. And then there was the decision in '94 to devolve the budgets down to the divisional level. So instead of you going to the dean and convincing him of something and the dean goes to the provost to get money for something, they basically said, all right, social sciences, this is your budget. So now when you try to get a line, it's coming out of sociology, it's coming out, I mean, to expand one department is at the expense of another unless the whole grows, okay? And that's, and it's neighbors that you're, I mean, so it's one thing to poach something from the medical school or from something like that, you know, but it's another thing when you got people in your department who are in that other department who go, wait a minute, you know? So I think that those little tiny changes change the political dynamics, and you know, we don't spend most of our time thinking about politics, but when you get in the chair's position, you are in that moment of having to be aware of and operating with the structural constraints so that the rest of your colleagues don't have to worry about that stuff. And
Well,
so
I do
think-
want to add one thing to that, though, John, which is I was on a committee to hire the first dean of the Harris School. And the Harris School had a lot of joint appointments from various departments. And I remember the lead candidate who turned down the job, when he was asked why, he said, "Who will wash my windows?" And what he meant by that was there are jobs to be done in your department, and you need people who are 100% in your department to do those jobs. And that if you have a lot of joint appointments and their home in some way is somewhere else, that's where a lot of their energy will go. That's an administrative answer, but I'm
Yep.
giving an administrative talk, so.
But I agree with it as an issue. Okay, and when Psych and HD separated, I have the minutes from the Psych meeting and the minutes from our discussion both, and had exactly the same discussion of we have to have our core functions covered by our core people who have their lines in our department.
But it's a matter of the university structure that forces those lines.
That's right.
Right, that's
And I
right.
think
Right, right.
you survived and made something out of that, but I think what's unfortunate is the University of Chicago and its greatness saw fit to inhibit the kind of interdisciplinarity that you were standing for.
Yeah.
You had to do it, but it's the university's organization that limited.
Yeah,
what
and
you
we
did.
were slow to this game, to our credit. That we avoided it for a long time, but I think we are in an era now where this kind of calculation is common.
From a historical point of view, I'd just like to say that from the ancient history of human development, that Havikhurst, Newgarden, and all the originators of the Committee on Human Development were fantastic fundraisers. They had everything paid for by outside agencies, including my salary for 14 of the 16 years I taught here, were paid by NIMH. These people didn't just depend on the university structure and what the dean decided them to give. They raised money, hand over fist, from day one in human development. That's one point. Another point is...
Are you volunteering?
Another point is, I'd just like to say, you know, interdisciplinarity has become a very sexy and term in American higher education, and everybody is advertising themselves as interdisciplinary. And an organization like the Committee on Human Development, now Comparative Human Development, on its 75th birthday, has a right to congratulate itself for being there first and keeping it going, interdisciplinary, more multidisciplinary. So, you know, that's another point that I think is worth taking into account. And there's the third thing I want to say is that again, to emphasize, I talked about the demise of the social relations department, at Harvard. But there's another, and I've talked about the secession of the biological anthropologists into a separate department of human evolutionary biology, which means they're completely separate from social anthropology, which they never were. And that's a terrible loss in comparison to what you have here, which is an integrated, or, with mutual tolerance and all that. But there's another thing that's happened, which is that the department that I went to when I left here, the Laboratory of Human Development at Harvard, doesn't exist. Neither does there is no human development program. There's a program for doctoral students in human development at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but there is no unit called human development anymore. And there was for many, many years. So whatever competition for HD here came from Harvard, it doesn't exist anymore. It's finished. There's no there's no kind of interdisciplinary unit that exists there. And okay, there's one final point I wanted to make, which is that because this is directly relevant to what you were saying about the abolition of clinical psychology because of all the requirements. Well, when I was chair of human development, when it existed at Harvard, the second time I was chair, I presided over the abolition of our counseling and consulting psychology program for exactly that reason, that with the cumbersome nature of the requirements for clinical training were just too ridiculous. And so we gave that up. And strangely enough, there was another, maybe he had just retired at the time, but John Schlein, who had been my colleague here in HD, and who was in charge of the clinical program when it was part of HD, the program he built at the Harvard Graduate School of Education was terminated. Unfortunately, when I was chair, and so I presided over that termination, but for the very reasons that you were talking about.
I think that we, at this point, could do something with clinical, but only if we partnered with social service or some other institutional connection to do it. I think having it inside is not possible anymore. And then you need work on both sides to set such a program up. I should say, for those who don't know, our undergraduates do have the option of taking a BA, Master of Social Work sequence, and it's quite popular with them. But our graduate students do not. So.
I think Rick and
Hello? Okay, Rick Schwader. I'm going to ask this question because of the turn which this general discussion has taken, and I admit I'm asking it looking forward because I believe this discussion is going to be before our faculty almost immediately. And what Norman didn't say is that he not only was master of the social sciences and chair of the Department of Behavioral Sciences for 6 years, he was also provost of this university during a time when the structures that have been described had not yet been imposed on the university, some of them as a result of McKinsey coming and making recommendations about how to run an organization or a corporation. And Norman may or may not want to answer the question, but it seems to me this is an opportunity for a broader faculty community discussion about the future and what his reaction is, having been there at a time when budgets were centralized and it hadn't been downloaded, when you weren't sitting there counting and competing for lines. What's his reaction to hearing this discussion of what's happened, and do we have a way of getting back to a system which may have worked better to allow flexibility and interdisciplinarity?
I don't know if you can get back to it, but I is firmly convinced it's a better system. And it's a better system for many reasons, but the one probably contemporary reason is it's much easier to maintain the strength of the university with flexibility about faculty, where you want to build new, strengthen emerging fields, where you want to withdraw resources from dying fields, and so forth. The departmental structure with lines assigned to departments is the worst possible structure to have an adaptable system to respond to changes in the fields of various sorts. I think it's just, I mean, all this has happened since I kind of was provost, and when I hear about it, I just curdle. I just think it's the worst thing. It just hampers the university terribly. The one thing which I always thought was one of the reasons that interdisciplinary work in the University of Chicago, not just in HD, but in lots of other places, lots of other parts of the university, was because of this budget flexibility. The fact is that if you wanted to have joint appointments or you wanted to do different things, you didn't cost the department anything. There wasn't this competition between departments. Also, just, I mean, if any of you who've had any experience with budgeting, it's just a lot easier to budget flexibly when you have big numbers than when you have small numbers that you, and so I could never convince a successor president who introduced this system that it was a bad system because, and that it, oddly, I mean, just digress a second, the system which traditionally, which I grew up on here and was still in effect when I was provost, was that we didn't have any fixed number of positions even at the division level. And yet when I did some analysis and so anyway, departments were instructed to be always looking for good people. If you came in with a proposal for a good person, we would do it. But you had to. So searches went on for a long time. People didn't say, "Oh, we've got to fill this position this year, otherwise we'll lose the line." This was brought home to me the first year I was provost. I got a proposal from the department, the Near Eastern Languages department, for an assistant professor in, let's see, some early language of various sorts. And I said, what, do we really need this? And they said, well, we've been looking for 7 years for somebody who can fulfill this requirement. This is essential to the Near Eastern language history and so forth. And it's that kind. So I said, okay.
Those are the days.
Well, actually, the chairman of the department wrote me the most beautiful 10-page letter explaining why this was essential to the history of understanding languages in the ancient Middle East and so forth. And that's the sort of both trust and dynamic in the system to keep the university great. I mean, that's basically what I was, and you just can't. And fields change, So in your, about biological anthropology or something like that. I mean, if that becomes a bigger field, you should be able to adjust to it. And not be rigid by the departmental kind of things like that. So it's to my mind, it's a completely alien way of thinking, and also extremely destructive to the long-term interests of the university. And I'm trying to modestly see if I can have any influence to try to reverse that. I can't see why it would be terribly difficult to reverse, but it does. I would say one other thing, though. However, it's like, I don't know if you studied communication networks, and the efficient networks are great if the central node is very efficient, but it also can become a block. So if you put what this system does is to give to essentially the provost in this system enormous power over the budget and where the faculty can be. But it's like many things. It looks more, and if you have a provost who doesn't understand things and so forth, who's has his own ideas, I'll come back. I want to come back about the chairmanships. You're running some danger in that sort of sense. So it does. The trust has to be in the faculty and the provost has to be somebody who understands and take advice and so forth about what fields are growing and what fields are doing. So, but I just want, in passing, about chairs, for those of you younger people here who may become a chair someday, one of the important things about being a chair is that your ideas about the field cannot dictate what the department or the group does. It's like a mediator in that sort of sense. One of the things I think ruined the psychology department and why it got into that situation was they had a succession of chairmen who thought they knew what psychology was all about, and they wanted to hire people like them or in the fields that they thought were great, and they didn't care about the other fields. And that produced the rancor that one got. And I think that unfortunately happens in lots of departments, around, not just here, but around, as I have talked to people in other universities. So but as I say, the centralization of the budget, to my mind, is the way to go, but it does have its risks.
Other people? Anybody? Wait, there's a mic coming to you.
But I guess I should comment on some of this as an audience member about the things that Bernice used to do. I don't know if the current chairs or future chairs still do that, but she used to do a lot of reading. And I think she used to get Scientific American on a regular basis, and she would read articles in there, and then she would send notes to her faculty and students about, did you see so-and-so and whatever. So one of the reasons in my theory about why she was such a good grant getter is she knew what was going on in the real world, and she knew how those questions that were related to the real world could be back translated into significant scientific and basic research questions that we needed to know more about. And I don't know, it seems like there is this issue of being an ivory tower, keeping to oneself, and having to do that in order to protect the purity that's associated with ideas and being able to express them and receive them and so forth. But there's also the issue of really, when you're trying to decide on a future, knowing what was going on. And Bernice, as I remember her, she knew that people developed and changed after age 5, 6, and 7. She just knew it. And she started to go out and work to get money to do something, to document and learn more about that and what that process was like. It seems to me that some of that, maybe those days of risk-taking like that are gone.
Those days of that money are gone.
I do want to say one thing about it, which is if you take a longer-term view, I would agree with you, Diana. I think the chair has some, and the whole faculty has a leadership responsibility to pay attention to the world. But I do think that part of what we're discussing here is a moment of transition where we were moved from independence into another program for 20 years, and when we came out, we had to come up with a model for now. And that yields a certain internal focus on we were talking about just getting bodies in place and aid for our students. But it's absolutely the case that the reason you want a well-running department is that you can then turn your energy outward to what things you can accomplish, what things need to be done, new areas you'd like to go into. But you have to have the aspirations met by the institution that there is that possibility. Yeah, so I do think we don't want to confuse this this moment of reconsolidation with what we would want always to be preoccupied about. Yeah, I do feel that my comment about how the world is changing, that we can't do clinical, but maybe we can do medical, that's more in the line of what you're saying of how can we get at issues like this in a way that doesn't require us to jump through hoops for the APA. Yeah.
What I did want to say, and I don't want to say it just because Larry and Susan are here, speaking of funds, the Gianninos have really been terrifically important for the department, and I'll tell you how, is that we have had many students who want to go abroad, say, to get the lay of the land before they come back to do research. This is one kind of example. Impossible to raise money to do this. We have been able to do it, and we have been able to do it with Giannino funds. And what the difference is, there are times when our department, with our small number, remember we're admitting normally 6 or 7 graduate students a year, we will have more Fulbrights than the departments of anthropology and sociology combined. And it's because our students, when the question on the Fulbright recommendation says, does your person understand this society? How are they going to get along? We can say, hey, they've already been there. They're really collecting data. We have, I see Christine back there nodding her head, is probably one who got one of those at one point. At any rate, I think that and that's a generalization to other things. That is, people can get their feet wet in something that costs money, and we've been able to produce the money to get them to do it. And that has meant, again, aside from the addition of knowledge and the quality of work, it's also a message that gets back to the higher level administrators who say, hey, you know, something really good is going on there. We have to pay attention to it. So I do want to throw that into this discussion, since we did start talking about getting funds. They have been very important at a central moment in our department for being able to provide that kind of resource during this period of building and being a kind of, in some ways, a mysterious place to the rest of our institution. So, stop and say that.
So I wanted to elaborate on comparative. I don't know what Suzanne was thinking, but as we discuss it in the department, we compare across ages, we compare across cultures, and we compare across species. And that's what. So how do we?
Clinical and normal populations.
Okay.
Originally.
No, go ahead. And across normal and clinical populations.
So a couple weeks ago at a faculty meeting, Rick asked me to be the discussant for this session, and I agreed to, but it didn't happen, and that's cool because I don't like discussant formats. But anyway, I came up with a question, and I still want to ask it. So speaking of faculty meetings, ours are enjoyable. We have a good time, and we have colleagues in other departments on campus and off campus. We know that there's a lot of, somebody used the word rancor earlier. They're contentious. They're not necessarily really happy departments. We're happy. So as chairs, not the work that you did, but the observations that you had, would you agree with that, that we're a happy department? And if so, how would you explain that?
No, why not?
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think that's partly what Bob Levine was talking about last night, is that whether or not we're interdisciplinary, we're mutually tolerant, and that in fact people like each other, and that makes a huge difference. There have been some very intense discussions particularly about hiring, and there are some other discussions about whether or not we should sit down and decide where the department is going, and things of that kind. But in general, I remember the same dean with whom I did not get along in what I thought was a complimentary insult. If you can imagine something, he says, "What have you been feeding your colleagues that they're all so happy?" So I heard that as slightly an insult. But the point partly at the University of Chicago, you really should think about how terrible the world is. And you should be worried all the time, so that if you are in fact cheerful, you must be intellectually deficient in some way. But I think compared to IM and one other department, still we have some leftover joint people. I should say, by the way, we didn't talk about Marlene Dixon here, which could be a whole other meeting. But what I have to say that when I didn't join CHD until 1996. And I was in I still am in before I retired, I was still in sociology. Two things. One is that when I joined here, some older members of sociology thought I was a traitor. That's from going back to 1968, right? But the other one is my other department is both somewhat much more rancorous, and people don't really like each other. So people don't spend time with each other, and they don't socialize and so forth. This department is really, and one of the things that attracted me to come here was I liked a lot of the people. And I think that really is a difference that has continued down to the present day.
We're not as unhappy as other departments. I think we have our differences, but I think we get over them, which I think is the key. It's not that you don't get upset. People get really upset sometimes, and sometimes it lasts a while. But we've always been able to pull it back together, usually because there's another alignment for the next issue or something like that. But I think that, when you're in a discipline, sometimes these fault lines are deeply etched into the field as a whole, and people find themselves representing positions that are very, very strong. We're looser. It's harder to get quite so backed up, I think, sometimes. It's my view.
So what I appreciate, and I've always appreciated about HD, is a respect for different ways of approaching problems. And I think that's really what I find in HD that I don't find in psychology, which has a much more rigid sort of, you got to do it in one way. These days we have to register hypotheses. There's the flexibility of being able to take a question and figure out the best way to answer that question. That's what HD does really well. So John, trained in HD, could take the bits of psychology that worked really well for him and the bits of anthropology that worked really well and the bits of linguistics. And that's what makes HD really great. And it's the respect, I think. You have to have respect among your faculty in order to make that work. So I think that's why we're happy, if we're happy.
I have just completed a research fellowship at NIH, and I found that no matter what problem you're working on, whether it's scientific or practical, it's interdisciplinary. And my topic was biomedical communication, the evolution of a paradigm. And so I interviewed 16 people at NIH, and we were talking to computer scientists, linguists, librarians, all kinds, about 16 people I interviewed. It's very interdisciplinary. And when you look at the departments, say when I was at the medical school, it's like a pie. It's a zero-sum game. You give somebody neurology, okay, then physiology would fight for it. Somebody else would want a garage, and so on. It just doesn't work that way. The model is outdated. All I want to say.
Rick, I think
Could I just make a comment on while you're moving to George? On the point that Bob Levine made about interdisciplinary being the sort of what everybody talks about doing, and certainly when I was at NSF, we were putting a lot of money into new programs to foster interdisciplinarity, even though a lot of people in the NSF staff didn't really understand what it was or how it worked. But there's a funny paradox, I think, and I've seen this, I mean, the advantage of being old, I guess, is you see cycles in things. When jobs are short, the professions become more rigid and more wanting to identify their own, sort of things like that. And so and I see this now because of the kind of the number of faculty positions in different fields is, it's tough and so forth. And so people want to be certified as a psychologist or anthropologist or whatever, and departments sort of demand that kind of in a way. So, which goes right against what's going on in terms of what we think, a lot of people think is, as you're saying, in terms of what complex research problems need interdisciplinary teams working on them and so forth. So it's a really paradoxical situation in which you have the departments and universities and so forth acting in one way, which is counter to what they say they want to, or at least many people want to be happening. And I saw this in the 80s, and I think this is one of the things that contributed to the decline, why social relations fell apart, because that was a period when, again, when faculty positions were very tight, and so people wanted to be, sociologists, certified sociologists, not as SOC-REL kind of people. Although I will say that the Harvard always, the SOC-REL department always gave their degree in the field. My degree is in social psychology, or you get a degree in clinical or sociology or anthropology. Not in social relations, but they were always careful to keep the degree that way.
I did want to say that for those of you who haven't been around for a while, that one of the things, the way we have responded to that, is that we now tell our students, pick a main identity. And so that you really do define yourself now as an anthropologist or a sociologist or a psychologist or a biologist with something else. So that you are that thing, but you're better or different or added on. And we've done that in response to just the thing that Norman is describing. So that we then encourage students, if you identify as an anthropologist, to go to anthropology workshops, take courses in the anthropology department. At the same time, you're still an HD person because you're taking courses in these other subjects, and you are also involved in workshops and so forth that play that role. So we have, in fact, may not be the best response, but I think, for example, and we really, it's a kind of, I've heard it as a kind of undertone in this discussion, is we've had a very good record of placing students. You heard all these, because they were from very different generations, the students in the previous panel, but a lot of them were new. 3 of them, I think, are pretty brand new, and we've had a very good placement thing, and it's not in human development departments. It is in departments of psychology or departments of anthropology, so that this model, I think, does work quite well.
So that's a nice note for bringing this to an end. Amanda and Lily have headed over to Illinois to prepare the way for dinner. I want to thank everyone. This is the end of the panels for the day, but we're now going to party over at dinner. But there are a few points I want to make about that. First of all, the dinner is at Ida Noyes Hall, so if you leave here and mosey out this alleyway to 59th Street and make a left turn and just walk a block and a half, that's where Ida Noyes Hall is on the left. The dinner is on the 3rd floor. There's a theater up there, and that's the room where we're having the dinner. There is an elevator. There are 2 things I want to note about the dinner. We have a lot of people for dinner, and we're going to organize this in the following way on the advice of our caterers. This is going to be open seating, so when you get over there, find a place, a table that you want to sit at. If you have people you want to sit with, try to organize that, but take a seat when you get there, because there's going to have to be a process by which the caterers are going to invite. Wine is going to be made available to you at your seat. There will be people bringing you a drink. Sit down, stay there, get your drink, and then you'll be instructed by the caterers in groups to go to the buffet and to the bar. if you want. The bar will have beer in addition to the wine that's going to be served. But please don't walk in and go to a bar or look for food. Go to a table, sit, and wait for instructions. I want to remind you, there's going to be an open mic after Margaret makes some comments, after I make some comments, after Susan Giannino makes some comments. The mic is going to be open. So if you've been waiting to make comments, testimonials, roasts, boasts, toasts, this can go on as long as we like. And I hope many of you will think about things you'd like to say and walk up to that open mic and do so. So that's the end of the session, and let's mosey on over to Ida Noyes.